Hello and welcome back to Doing Death with your host Jan. Last week I gave you a challenge to talk about death with as many people or in as many situations as possible. It could have been about any aspect of death and dying, a tall order possibly for many of you, no doubt, with perhaps little opportunity presenting itself, I hear you say. Except many of us would have had the opportunity to talk about death and dying without realising. As with the start of any new year, the news that a celebrity has died hits our TVs and social media. Maybe that could have been a way into the conversation. Or you might have been out for a walk with the family and you might have noticed a bench with one of those commemorative plaques on it. I know that death is difficult to talk about, I get that. It brings up lots of uncomfortable emotions, so we tend to shy away from it. We don't want to think about it, let alone talk to our older relatives or our grown-up children or even our younger children, heavens forbid, about what worries we have about dying. Having conversations with people you love about death and dying is difficult. So what are some of the barriers to talking about death? Age Concern carried out some research in 2017 which showed that older people are more able and willing to have these conversations with their peers than they are with their younger friends and relatives. The research also found that younger adults don't want to start conversations about death and dying, especially when it comes to things like wills and executor responsibilities, because they don't want to be seen as money grabbing, and so they're more likely to shut down conversations with older friends and relatives who are trying to bring up the conversation. They might say things like, "Oh, don't talk like that, Mum, you're being so morbid," or "Don't worry about that, we'll sort it out when the time comes." But these responses are common conversation stoppers, making it impossible for people wishing to discuss the important aspects of their affairs with those who will be left to sort them out after they've gone. So, barrier number one, then, in a nutshell, avoidance. Another barrier to talking about death is that it simply hasn't touched our lives on a personal basis. We've had no personal experience of it, and people generally only fleetingly think about the emotional side of losing someone close to them. So, barrier number two, there's just been no personal experience of loss, death, and dying. People are worried about starting conversations because they're not sure which language to use and they're frightened of causing offence. We also become scared about what we might hear, and we're unable to handle the emotional fallout about our own mortality or the mortality of those we love. What would happen to us, for example, if we were no longer able to take care of ourselves due to a physical or mental condition? So, barrier number three then. Talking about death and dying just feels completely wrong. It's unfamiliar and scary. So, conversations about death tend to only come up when they need to. But being able to talk about this topic gives us the opportunity to prepare for how we might feel when the time comes. As most of us will actually be emotionally unprepared for a death, talking about it helps us to feel more empowered and confident to ask questions of each other and to listen and engage in conversations with older family members who might want or need to have these discussions. It's not uncommon to hear people who have been recently bereaved say that they wish that they'd been more prepared. Our levels of preparedness will vary depending on whether there's an ongoing or significant personal relationship with someone who's passed away, or if there's been a long-term illness. It's important to talk about death and dying with those you love before we need to, so we can help them and ourselves accept the inevitable and to have an unpressured conversation about any fears and or wishes that close family members might have that are connected with dying. So being able to talk about it gives us all the opportunity to share openly about any worries we might have. Talking about death before we need to also equips us with the knowledge and the ability to ask the right questions in order to navigate and challenge the systems and organisations that we'll come into contact with, such as healthcare professionals at the hospital or care home, or when we have to deal with the funeral director after the death has happened. Discussing death before we actually need to means that we have the time to understand what we want for our own death or that of a loved one. And so these conversations give us the opportunity to prepare wills, settle finances, and to put in place funeral plans and other wishes. For example, whether we want to donate our organs or be kept on a life support machine. This is particularly helpful when we think about any care that could be needed, such as a requirement for a power of attorney or an executor, should we be unable to make decisions due to poor physical or mental health. And family members are the ones that are completely central to these conversations, because it's likely that they are the ones who need to know what's required of them and how to carry out our loved ones' wishes. Families are often displaced. Think about that, with people moving away from areas they grew up in. This means that, children, adult children, can live far away from their parents and each other. And so spending time, quality time, having these conversations will help to smooth out any uncertainties about who's responsible for what, and can avoid straining. If for any ordinary family, there can be certain dynamics at play which result in strained relationships. So these conversations early on could help to smooth out this strained experience. I see this aspect play out regularly in my role as a funeral professional. Sometimes siblings are undecided and are sometimes even quarrelling amongst themselves about what type of send-off a parent will want, or who will conduct the service, whether there'll be a church service or whether they want to go straight to the crematorium, for example. In any conversations you have, though, it's important not to forget to involve the smaller children, the younger kids. I've literally lost count of the times where children have been overlooked, mollycoddled, either in the lead up to the death and afterwards. And many of us think even that it's inappropriate for children to attend funerals. So looking at your own family dynamic, you'll probably see where there are the opportunities for the younger kids to have an open conversation with the grandparents, and there's a lot of reason. There's no reason at all why death can't be included in these open and honest discussions. And as a parent myself, I know full well that our natural instinct is to protect our children from the things that might cause pain and suffering. We don't want to think about them worrying about the things that they don't need to. But while conversations about death and dying are uncomfortable, as parents, we can help to normalise the subject so that it becomes less shocking or uncomfortable. And how often we underestimate a child's ability to understand and cope with the truth about these difficult topics is more prevalent than you think. And children can and do attend funerals, for example, and there are lots of studies to suggest that it's a positive thing for them to do. For those who are ready and need to have these conversations, for example, an adult child who is always finding a way to shut the discussion down, think about what you might want to say beforehand. So, parents, older parents, say in their, 60s, 70s, 80s even, think about what you might want to say beforehand. Think about at least 3 things that you want to achieve in advance of the conversation. And this might help you to, tackle any nervousness you might have and remain confident about keeping the conversation going with your adult child, even if the other person seems to want to move away from the discussion. Alternatively, if an opportunity arises unexpectedly, at work, over dinner, perhaps, be purposeful about how you approach the subject. Keep language simple and obviously be sensitive to your listener. So that's it, really. It's being able to have these talks starts with us as individuals. With an acceptance that we're not going to be around forever. And so, being sensible and purposeful about having these discussions is going to help us all in the long run. This week's challenge is, while you're out and about on your travels this week, notice some of the things which help you actively come to terms with your own mortality. It could be the local nursing home that you drive past on the school run, or the elderly person you always see in the queue at the supermarket. It could be anything. Think about why it reminds you of your mortality, and then go on to think about a way that you could have a constructive discussion about it with someone that you trust, someone that you care for. This exercise doesn't need to be too serious or daunting. I don't want you to be, plunged into a state of morbidity or languishing in fear. But you could even find a reminder in something funny if you wanted to. I find humour is perfectly okay in terms of talking about death and dying. It doesn't need to be morbid or sombre. So, look to anything to remind you that you're not going to be around forever, and give it a go. Let me know how you get on. Remember, talking about death is a reflection, not only on dying, but on life itself. Thanks for listening, and until next time, take care and live well.